Is one permitted to eschew or abjure the Witch of Endor on the somewhat intricate technical understanding that the Witch of Endor, I don't say stands for, but the Witch of Endor is the enemy in as the contacted in the Carl Schmitt understanding of the enemy being the outside of the polis, the vogue. Hegel, in his youth, translates polis as vogue, or the outside of the political in Schmitt's sense. But in Schmitt's sense, the political would seem to mean something like culture, in the sense that Mishima says twice the Americans forced the Japanese to look in the mirror of the Americans, and therefore they awoke. So like the magic wand waved in a Maeterlinck play, the Japanese awoke and ceased to be in this raw situation of the Gaijin, or the foreign devils, being on the outside, which would correspond to Carl Schmitt's enemy, and the people, the Volk, being on the inside, meaning the Alatai people are the Japanese who immigrated from the Alatai Mountains in archaic times to the island where those hairy Ainu people are, or however they're called. If we examine the 13th century, when first we should say, to begin with, the Rambam or Maimonides is often put in the same bracket with Aquinas, and one wants to say, here we have the guide to the perplexed, meaning the guide to those who have failed to understand that one must go to the Mishnah Torah, which was the more important work of Maimonides at the time. The rationalizers, but the Maimonides is constantly understood as a rationalizer, just in a similar way that one says Aquinas as brought in, accomplished the Aristotelian synthesis. So there was a few texts by Plato, which mainly, and the Neoplatonist, which mainly went into the sort of Pauline Christianity and into the discussions of the bishops, the council discussions, which formed the Christian system, which had, of course, only 200 years or so since the official breakup, I think in, 1056, 1057 or whatever, but one could say that's totally misleading, because there was always a schism between the different forms of Christianity in the Armenian Church, and the Coptic Church, and the Bishop of Rome, and the Emperor Bishop in Constantinople was shy of the division of Christ from Caesar, or Xerxes from Christ, however you like. So we have this spirit in the 13th century of Thomas and Maimonides, which seems similar, and therefore one has a suspicion of everything said, in some sense. Is it totally an accidental feature of the time, looked at from the point of view of Athens rather than Jerusalem? But on the other hand, looked at from the point of view of Jerusalem, you could say Judaism is a living Welt, or a living people, so that Hashem is the living God. So then you have this, of course there is something that seems to be a transfer of the teaching. But on the other hand, if you look at the specific issue of the Witch of Endor, what we have here is the issue that it's not a philological problem. It's not a question of a word being interpreted strangely or something like that, but straightforwardly have a king. King Saul has attempted to, and successfully, according to what's enacted in the text, what's described, in the text, encountered indeed the prophet Samuel, whom he was seeking. The way that he did this was by the prohibited act of consulting the Pythoness, or the Pythia, or the witch, as it's called, of Endor, who was transmuter to the other region, who was able to enable this experience, which Saul indeed, according to the straightforward reading of the text, and just the translation is not challenged, we have acquired this knowledge of straight from the text. But then there's the question of how is this text read? So one can say only at the time of the Mishnah Torah in the 13th century do we get this rational, so-called quote-unquote rationalized version, where we have a seemingly incompatible testimony, as sometimes happens in Maimonides. Possibly in the weakest version, we could say, because Maimonides forgot what he had written earlier and wrote something different later on, because he writes one thing about the Witch of Endor when talking about the first book of Samuel. He writes something different when he's talking about in a separate discussion necromancy as something which was boasted of by the non-Jews in order to seduce the Jews into either into doing something on the version treated in the whole tradition, I would say, into doing something wicked, but in the second version of Maimonides, in the version about necromancers, into doing something merely stupid and silly, because it's not even efficacious. It doesn't even work. So in the first version, he said something like, God has made the world in such a way that it is possible to contact the dead, and this is what we're seeing, of course, in the text, as the text shows us. King Saul having a discussion and learning something from the prophet Samuel, who was dead at the time, through the medium of the Witch of Endor. So somebody who was a non-Jew presenting these forbidden teachings. But then in the part about necromancy, he says, oh yeah, so I just said that. So so there's a seeming incompatibility. In one sense, he says this is, yes, real when he's talking about Samuel 1. In the second one, he says anyone who this stuff isn't real, and therefore the implication is that in despair, King Saul had a schizophrenic moment where he was taken in and believed that the Witch of Endor showed him the prophet Samuel, because anything, or he was just so much in despair that even though he didn't really believe it, he just stupidly went along with it, sort of. But it's shown right there in the text as though it was. So this is what I'm saying, is that this question, which can stand in for a question of a form of transcendence. So we see this incompatibility between what we are told to, not by someone outside, but let's say in this case, by our own reason, as it seems to make sense to us, just as the cannibal thinks not twice about cannibalism. It makes sense to him. He doesn't question it. There's something within us, an authority that is us, that makes us say, so in our own condition, since we're closer to the enlightened version, which actually corresponds to what, it's interesting, the enlightened version corresponds to what Maimonides is saying about the first book of Samuel, because what he's saying is Hashem has made the world in such a way that to allow for contact with the dead prophet Samuel, but that this is no different than the laws of gravity. So this is a very like Copernicus, who, however, only came along several hundred years later, but it's also very much like this wonderful living hierarchical principle of Plato, just like the geometrical system, Pythagorean system, which is still thought in Descartes, which is still thought in, maybe not in Descartes so much. There's a debate between Descartes and the English Neoplatonists. But in any case, which is still a great question in the rational enlightenment about, is there in the system which in the Middle Ages was called geometry in the sky, the system of these mathematics in the sky, just as music is mathematics in time, according to the old way of thinking, and mathematics in space, not in the sky, mathematics in space. So this idea that associated with the Galileo, with Copernicus, with Kepler, and then later in our own time vaguely still remembered in many debates, such as Lenin still wanted to kind of cling to something more like that. So in other words, atheism meant belief in something like that. God is this extended substance, is geometrical substance or something like that. Atheism is then can be contrasted with sort of just a drop of caring about any of those issues, or in Nietzsche's sense, the rising up to nihilism. The drop of caring about those issues, I should say, go to Eric Vogelin, and then he'll tell you how stupid we are compared to people 100 years ago or 200 years ago, when it was possible to reach higher levels of technical understanding and reflection in thinking, before we got to our level of just saying everything is subjective if it's in the direction of speculation. So looking at these two sides of Maimonides has the outside of our intelligence, I find, to be a worthy reflection, because it shows us that there's a point where there's a contact between, one, the age that's moving in a certain direction. We want to start thinking about these and these issues. We become suddenly more Aristotelian. We become suddenly more interested in these Pythagorean questions. They're awoken. Telescopes advance, and we start thinking about the stars beyond the visible stars, which were in the Ptolemaic system believed to be the sum of all the stars. Our imagination moves as a whole in a certain direction, and then our reason finds cogent things according to that whole And so this is a sort of a vague, dreamy version of historicism. There's a whole of thinking. We're in it. We have to respond to it. Das Man. There's certain issues everyone responds to. Everyone's been grown into. And then there's kind of some traditions moving against that. And then in this case, we have a very particular case of Maimonides, who we must interpret. Is Maimonides moved by the avant la lettre? I forget the correct pronunciation, but before the letter, before we had this word enlightenment or Aufklärung or Lumières or however, before we had this idea of the what became this Saint Simonism and all these notions of technology bringing progress through the Galilean mechanics, through especially Newton, who was supposed to have brought light to all things. We had this early faint presage, as it were, in Thomas and in Maimonides and in some Arabic scholars, in Veros and Avicenna and so on. So, who may have, the algebra. So that we have algebra coming already, pushing up this new mass that Descartes develops, right? Because Descartes makes a link between algebra and geometry, so that they can be translated. Even in a way, arguably, you could see the Arabic world as pushing this. Of course, there's a time when the Arabs had the best libraries and the best access to the text, and that was it's very close in there with Thomas and Maimonides. But so with this whole confluence, I think it makes a good analogy with any time. So that you could see Maimonides could be interpreted as being thrust into these forces. He could be interpreted as having a direct textual problem, and that if he has to follow the Torah literatum, he must say that this vision that Saul had of Samuel, affected by this outsider, the witch of Endor, was real, because that's what the Torah says. It reports it straightforwardly as something that just like anything it says narrates. It narrates that. As otherwise, we have to start guessing. Are there moments when there's an irony in the Torah where it says Moses said this or that, but it wasn't meant seriously? It wasn't meant to actually describe what's happening. So I think there's a limited number of real considerations which can be concretely shown in this issue of Maimonides' two seemingly incompatible statements, where one, he seems to be saying, yes, this was real, yes, the system of nature allows for communication with the dead, and then two, in his other conversation, where in the weak formulation, yes, he just forgot. I regard that, by the way, as quite plausible. Maybe he just kind of forgot what he was saying a little bit. As many years had passed, maybe he forgot. On the other hand, if you take it in the strongest view, Maimonides, the sage, Maimonides, the great authority, Maimonides, in Heideggerian terms, sort of the essential thinker of Judaism, then you have to take the quandary he puts down seriously, which is that he says, on the one hand, only an imbecile would believe in something like contacting the dead. You have to be a complete idiot. And when somebody like the Witch of Endor tries to seduce you to that, they're just trying to play you for a fool. There's nothing more to it than that. Or maybe they believe it, but they shouldn't, because it's anyone can see that it's nonsense. If you take that side of it, then you have to read the first side to say Saul was crazy, and this is what the text shows is kind of a schizophrenic vision. On the other hand, if you look at the first side, you have to say the second side either means that something changed, or that there's something special in the maybe it was like the parting of the Red Sea. Maybe it was something that doesn't usually happen in the system of nature, but Yahweh, or I say Yahweh, but because I don't really recognize the logic of the trick, Hashem, okay, the name, but we already know what we're talking about, so what's the point? It's just like they say the Jews in Israel recognize a prohibition against raising swine on the ground of Israel, and the way they do it is by building a pig house, which is a certain number of centimeters above the ground, and then they say it's not on the ground of Israel. This kind of tricks. So that's always part of the tradition. So I suppose in this sense, I'm more on the side of I could see it. So I guess I would say I could see it both ways and investigate it both ways, but I'm slightly more naturally used to seeing it this sort of Jacob Klein or Leo Strauss way. Jacob Klein and Leo Strauss were by some regarded as atheists because they took too much of a rationalist view, right? To me, maybe I'm just lukewarm, because I could see we could take really seriously the Orthodox view, but we could also take really seriously the view that what seems to be cogent in the current time, which is more a Leo Strauss kind of reasoning, more reason rather than Sithra Torah, rather than the mysteries of the Torah. In other words, rather than something a Torah just states. But see, even there, the tradition would say why this is a mystery is because we can't. The reasoning is difficult. But I think the more gross issues are issues like this. It's straightforwardly described in the text, the meeting with Samuel who was dead, right? And then this attempts to do what the Catholics do, which is always to say the Bible is a library, Libra, it's a library, and some of the books are meant to be understood as metaphors, some as metonymy, some as blah blah blah, analogies, etc. So there's quite a few difficulties to be sorted out, but if nothing more, I think that's a good, modest exercise, at least for somebody who wants to sort of have an object to use to address these things, in order that one can discuss them with oneself and each other, because we have this everything that I just said and these issues as something, as it were, an object for the mind or an object for language, so that then one can discuss it both with oneself at different times, remember through memory, and with each other.